All right, guys. So today we are looking at our lumbo-pelvic-hip complex. We're going to be looking at all the bones and the muscles that are associated with basically, the really what is your core. A lot of people think like when they hear like they're like, oh, I got to do more core work. They think they're abs, right? They're trying to carve out like a six pack or something. But your core, right, the center of what you are, and the center from where you exert all of your force from is really your lumbo-pelvic hip complex. It's where your lumbar spine's interacting with your pelvis and how your pelvis is interacting with your lower limbs and that whole area there. So we're going to be looking at that today. So your lumbo-pelvic hip complex, right, is going to be the anatomic structures of your lumbar and thoracic spine, a little bit of thoracic spine, right? Like it's the mid back a little bit as well. So lumbar and thoracic spine, the pelvic girdle, that's going to be the two sides of your pelvis, and the hip joint, which is a fun little joint that we're going to spend some time on. So that's all of those pieces together, right? That's the actual lumbo-pelvic hip complex. And you'll see this shortened to LPHC a lot of times. A lot of times we're writing this, we'll just say LPHC, but so don't get thrown off by that if you see that written on in your reading and stuff. But the lumbar spine, right? So that's going to be our lower portion, right? Your L1 through 5, right? So this is the portion of the spine commonly referred to as the small of your back. You can think of it as like your low back, right? That's the lumbar spine. So there's a lot of forces that are at play here, affecting movement of the spine, right? Like in the front, we've got muscles that allow us to, perform spinal flexion and then pull the spine down anteriorly. We've also got spinal extension. We've got muscles in the low back that pull it, posteriorly. So if you've got those two movements there, well, you've also got rotational movements. You've got your oblique muscles that allow you to kind of rotate from side to side. You've got lateral flexion. There's a lot of movement that can happen in that lumbar spine. And this is an area that is greatly affected, kind of similar to our knee joint. It's greatly affected by the forces that are below it and the forces that are above it. So we definitely want to keep this area healthy and teach it how to stabilize. We need it to stay in optimal alignment as often as possible. And alignment is really going to be the key thing that we talk about. Then we've also got your thoracic spine. That's going to be the 12 vertebrae in the mid-torso that attach to your rib cage. So this middle section right in here, that's your thoracic vertebrae. And there's going to be 12 individual spinal discs of that. Luckily, obviously there's movement that's going to happen here as well. But the ability to kind of stabilize this is a little bit easier sometimes, and honestly is a little bit better addressed when we start talking about the upper back area when we get to like the shoulder girdle on tomorrow. But for now, lumbar spine is going to be a big part of the conversation. A little bit of the thoracic spine, like the bottom portion of it. And then the pelvic girdle is a big one, right? So your pelvic girdle is the anatomic structures consisting of, and we're going to call this your acetabulum. That's the sort of big name for the pelvis here. We call it the acetabulum. So that's the two sides of what are called your individual like iliums. So this is an ilium right here, this thick big flare, right? And so you've got your left and right iliums there. And so where those two are coming together, like forming this overall like girdle, that's your acetabulum, okay? And then you've got your sacrum, which is the below your lumbar spine here. It's this little triangular shaped bone that is actually holding the two sides of your pelvis together. And so like this can actually become dysfunctional sometimes. You'll actually see occasionally like a misalignment between the joint where your sacrum is holding your pelvis together. And that can reduce mobility, which can, become very, very, very painful. And then the very, very bottom, we've also got your coccyx, which is your actual little tailbone there. So that's the overall pelvis, right? The individual ilium, so that's the acetabulum, those two things working together, the sacrum and the coccyx. And then lastly, the other thing we got to talk about in the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex is we got to look at your hip joint, which is right here. It's a ball and socket joint. This is the articulation between your pelvic bones and the top of your femur. So your femur sits, it's got this really big, it's got a ball at the end of it because it's a ball and socket joint, and it sits in this area right here, and then it's covered in connective tissue that kind of holds it in place. So ball and socket joints are amazing because they are incredibly mobile joints. They are the most mobile types of joints that we've got. The two most mobile joints in your body are going to be your shoulder and your hip joint. But the problem here is with increased mobility often comes decreased stability. And so stabilizing that hip joint and moving it the way that it's really designed to move optimally is often affected pretty easily by muscle imbalances either below or above that joint. So we're going to see how today, like a lot of overactive muscles are really putting a lot of pressure on the pelvis. So that is going to be the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex, right? It's your acetabulum, sacrum, coccyx, and femur, and lumbar spine. So it's that whole area kind of coming together. So looking at this, by the way, you can see, like I said, it's a ball and socket joint, right? And you can see like it is going to sit in this little cavity. And so, when it inserts there, it's going to hold in that position. So you can see like your femur is going to have the head of it right here. It's going to have this big, knobby head on the end of it that is covered in cartilage. And that cartilage allows it to, create all of those different movements and rotations and things like that. While still like, having stability. But then we are also going to see out here is this big knob on the outside. That's what's called the greater trochanter of your femur. And so this big knob, which you can feel if you feel into your hip, you'll actually feel that hard bone that kind of sticks out compared to the rest of your thigh. That's your greater trochanter, and there's a lot of muscles that attach to that, and that's where a lot of forces are being exerted from. And then obviously some in the front as well. So that is the hip joint proper. So there's sort of a difference here between like our SI joint, your sacroiliac joint. That's where your sacrum is meeting with your pelvis. There's a little bit of a difference between like where your lumbar spine is meeting with your sacrum, and there's a difference between like how your pelvis is interacting with your femur. But even though there's a difference in terms of how all of those are interacting, they are all codependent on each other. It is an interdependent system. So there's 29 to 35 muscles that attach to the lumbar spine and pelvis. That's a pretty freaking large list. Luckily, we group a lot of them together into pairs, so it's actually pretty easy to understand. But one thing that we definitely know is that dysfunction in the lower extremities or dysfunction in the upper extremities can cause dysfunction in the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex. So we've seen shoulders affect the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex. We've seen ankle problems affect the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex. It comes from both sides. It's in the dead center, so it's most likely to be affected by, the forces around it. So just looking at some of the epidemiology here, like some of our most common injuries of the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex, we are going to see low back pain. This is the most common injury that affects people. The most chronic type of pain that affects like most people is just general low back pain. So this is just general aches and pains in the lower portion of your spine, in your lumbar spine, right? Very, very, very common. About 80% of adults will have some type of, and it says, just says 80% of adults here, but what we mean is 80% of adults will experience chronic low back pain at some point in their life. So it's lasting, maybe upwards of 6 weeks sometimes. Very, 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 very common. It's 8 out of 10. It's 8 out of 10 people. And then more than a third of these, more than a third of more than a third of all work-related injuries are somewhat involved in the low back. Somebody lifting something the wrong way, moving the wrong way, and damaging their low back. My mom has 7 broken vertebrae. She actually has pretty severe stenosis, which is basically a calcification of the spine. So for some reason, and this actually happens to me as well. This sort of runs in my mom's side of the family, and unfortunately, I inherited it as part of the sort of an unlucky genetic bag. But you'll sometimes see certain individuals will actually store extra calcium ions in their spine. And so when you look at it, you will see sometimes that you'll get like bone spurs where there'll basically just be a little bit of extra bone tissue that really shouldn't be there. And when that happens, when there's that extra bone tissue, what'll happen, it almost looks like your bones are kind of flattening out, right? It kind of looks like they're being kind of mashed together and grinding. And so you'll sometimes see stuff like this, where you'll see these like really intense little bone spurs. And then this spine, which is meant to be able to rotate and flex and extend and do all these like crazy movements, now suddenly there's hard tissue in the way, keeping that movement from happening. So this is actually why, like, I've got a little bit of low back pain. Just a little bit of inherited from my mom's side of the family. But my mom, much more intense, her bone spurs, that calcium basically grew into like one large chunk, and it's calcium, it's hard bone. And so all of a sudden she was working at the pet store one day, and she turned around to like bag up a customer, and she felt this big pop, and broke a whole bunch of the discs in her back. And luckily it didn't affect her spinal column in any capacity other than creating lots of pain. But it didn't paralyze her or anything. But it's just, extremely, extremely painful. And that happened to my uncle just the other day, actually. So my uncle Jeff, the same freaking thing happened like 6 weeks ago. He just had surgery for it. And then the same thing happened to their dad, my grandpa. So, it is kind of inherited, which is one of the reasons why like I work out so often and tend to be kind of a leg guy. I really enjoy leg day, and I put a lot of effort into it because I'm constantly working on, strengthening my lumbo-pelvic-hip complex so that I don't really have to deal with this kind of problem. And if I can maintain that mobility, hopefully we'll see less pain. So very, very, very common. You're going to see it in most of your clients with some version of low back pain at some point. And a lot of times it just comes from poor biomechanics, moving the wrong way. We'll also see sacroiliac dysfunction. I feel like I'm talking about all the injuries I've had lately, but this is actually something I actually had to deal with sort of in the middle of quarantine. I went and played in my ultimate game, and it was like our first week back after not playing for a little while. And so someone threw me a pass. It wasn't a very good pass, and I tried to run it down, and I went in for like a layout dive, which I'm normally very apt to do, but I just hadn't done it in a few weeks. So I got really nervous and chickened out at the last minute, like caught the disc and then tried to tuck my knees under and like roll, which is totally not, if you land on your stomach, you just slide. It's very safe and easy. And what I ended up doing was jamming my right femur into my hip socket. And I felt fine for the rest of the game and, played for the rest of the day, but ended up basically moving a good chunk of this bone from one side to the other. And I couldn't get it back in alignment. It was like a really intense problem that I had for a little while. Now, when I say like alignment, here's the thing about your SI joint, guys. You want to have movement in this joint, but not too much movement. So too little movement can create this pinching sensation. And what ends up happening is your whole pelvis gets locked down. So what was happening with me, for instance, your pelvis is designed to be able to do a little bit of rotation front to back like this, a little bit of elevation side to side like that, a little bit of anterior posterior movement, right? So it's designed to move in all three planes of motion, just a little bit. And so when you're walking, you'll actually twist your pelvis like this. It creates little bits of rotational movement on either side. And what ended up happening with me, when I like popped this thing out of alignment, is that this side got locked down. And so then I could move forward over here, but this side on my right was just literally not moving at all. It was completely like locked down. So I went to and by the way, I'm not exactly a huge fan of chiropractors generally. I mean, I think that it's one of those things where it's like, if you go to a chiropractic doctor, it's great. But there are so many like chiropractic oh, what do they call it? Like something there's a step below chiropractors and they can just call themselves chiropractors. And they, people who work at like the Joint, those places you'll see around LA or anywhere else. Um, and basically they just do like an adjustment. They're just there and they crack and they do all this stuff. And there's not really a lot of evidence to suggest that it does anything. But if you do have like an actual like misalignment of like a bone, and you can go in and get like an actual treatment like targeted directly towards something rather than just a general adjustment, it can be very effective. And so I went to this chiropractor and over in Van Nuys, and I was like, hey, like my pelvis is out of alignment. Like I had this really hard impact, and I just need it popped back into place. And he was like, yeah, no problem. This guy was huge. He used to work with the Raiders, actually. He was like an athletic trainer for them. And this guy was massive. He like grabs me. He's like, ugh. And I was like, anything? And I was like, no. And like this guy worked on me. I had to go back for like 4 or 5 sessions. And he was like putting all of his weight. He was like, people's elbow dropping on my freaking hip, trying to knock it back into place, and it just wasn't going. And then one day, my buddy Chuck let me have one of his muscle relaxers, and I went in and I was like, all right, I just took a muscle relaxer, like, and everything should be real loose, like, let's do this. And sure enough, like, he friggin' jumped up on my hip and popped it back into alignment, and then I was 100% like that. Felt a little sore, but other than that, really good. So you can see, again, alignment, hugely important. And sacroiliac dysfunction, SI pain, pretty uncommon. I'd say this is one of the less common ones that we'll see, but it can happen. By the way, this happens slowly over time too. You can pull this out of alignment. I did it kind of like traumatically, but you can do it like slowly over time too. If you are a leg tucker, if you like to tuck one leg up under your body while you are sitting, that can sometimes be associated with sacroiliac dysfunction, because what it does, it creates a hip drop on one side and a hip elevation on the other. Or if you happen to sit on your wallet, if you're like a back pocket wallet person, and like you sit on it all day and it's always the same side. Like my dad, I'm just doing a lot of personal examples today, but my dad, you can see all of his jeans. You can see where his wallet's at, like, because he sits in the same spot like every single day. So he's got like a worn out patch in every pair of his jeans. And like, that, like I said, that can elevate one side and it leads to this dysfunction, the sacroiliac dysfunction. So your hips can become offset when one hip is higher than the other, or when one is anteriorly rotated. Generally, I would say, I don't know if this is a rule, but the most common I've seen is where you'll see one client with like elevation. You'll see like a slight scoliosising of the spine. When we look at like SI joint dysfunction, elevation. So we'll see like one hip basically just becomes a little bit too offset compared to the other. There we go. I was like, I know there's a picture here. So it'll look something kind of like this. Basically, you'll have like one side of the pelvis either pulling too much and then that'll raise it, or one, and then the other one's being pulled down, or vice versa in the other direction. So a lot of times what we need to do is strengthen that pelvis like back to neutral, and get an even amount of force being pulled from both sides. And that's going to happen from some muscles that we'll be going over a little bit today. So we don't want to see that lateral curvature of the spine, that scoliosising, So definitely very, very, very common one. Another one. Oh, and by the way, one other thing, you will also sometimes see, and this isn't mentioned in the PowerPoints, but I want to talk about this. If you guys ever see this, Trendelenburg gait. So occasionally when someone has SI joint dysfunction, remember your pelvis is designed to rotate, a little bit of anterior posture and a little bit of like lateral, like up and down, right? And so when someone's pelvis is stuck and it's locked and it cannot rotate, they will walk like this. And that's a little bit.
Notice how in the gait.
Okay, he's kind of doing like I do. He's kind of over exaggerating this, but you can see like basically see this like side to side movement. Usually it's also on one side. It's pretty rare that you'll see people doing it on both sides, but it kind of looks like this. Here we go. This is actually probably a much better example. Sort of more natural here. So you see how like there's this kind of intense like hip drop on one side, right? Very rarely you'll see it on both sides where there's just total SI dysfunction. Like if both sides are just really tight, and it honestly kind of looks like somebody's doing like an overly exaggerated like catwalk, you know. But that's what a Trendelenburg gait is. And so when you see that in a client, you know, that's going to indicate to you that there's some sacroiliac dysfunction. Another one we're going to see are just your general hamstring, quad, and probably the most common, groin tears or groin strains. So tight muscles in the lumbo-pelvic-hip complex get overly active, and then they cannot distribute forces properly and end up pulling. So very, very common there. I felt like I like as soon as I hurt my hamstring, like 2 other people in my life also hurt theirs. You know, so relatively common thing here. We'll also see disc herniations, and this is probably the one that a lot of people are thinking of when they think of like low back injuries. They kind of jump to the idea of like a disc herniation, and so this is a condition where here's what your spinal disc looks like, right? So you can see there's this little bit of, they call it fibrocartilage, that surrounds each of your individual like spinal discs, right? So you can see like this is kind of wrap here, and then inside is this this what's called this nuclear material, this nuclear pulsus, which is this soft tissue. Now, what can happen is if you move this hard tissue really abruptly without stabilizing, and then there's excessive motion in this hard tissue, is that it can tear this soft tissue, because this is just cartilage. This is kind of a wet sack, you know? And so if you tear that open, what ends up happening is that nuclear pulsus starts leaking out. And you'll see here, here's your spinal cord, and your spinal, like here's your spinal cord dead center here. And then each of your peripheral nerves branching out, you know, from your central system into your peripheral system. Well, if you start leaking this material out and it starts pinching that spinal nerve, that's going to create irritation and pain. So we'll see numbness, tingling, irritation, pain, you know, all those things. And oftentimes you'll hear people describe this as a pain that kind of shoots downwards or shoots upwards. That's a very common version of like our disc herniations. So yeah, definitely a very, very, very common injury that we're going to see. One that they're not mentioning here that's also very common is you will see what is sometimes called piriformis syndrome. And piriformis syndrome is basically, it's kind of like IT band syndrome. Like it sounds like you caught something, but really what it is you have just developed a super tight muscle. And so this muscle right here, your piriformis, which is meant to stabilize your sacrum over to your femur here. If that muscle gets really, really tight, it can actually pinch your sciatic nerve between like the bone and this muscle. So your sciatic nerves are going to travel down, and then they're going to branch down, you know, on either side of the pelvis there. If you start pinching that, that creates like this what you'll often hear people describe as like a leg pain that shoots down their leg. Yeah, it feels like it's running down their entire leg. I'm sure probably actually most people in this call have probably heard like a family member, like an older family, like say that type of pain or something. But that is commonly associated with piriformis syndrome. You'll see that sometimes in certain types of athletes who actually do like a lot of lateral movement. I find that's common in like basketball players and then defensive football players. And this is the very rare feet turn out, or sorry, not feet turn out, but knees cave out situation. A lot of times when your client's actually, a bow-legged posture, which I said is, very, very rare. A lot of times it's due to a tight piriformis. Any questions on any of the conditions or diseases or anything? Are we feeling good? Okay.
Yes, sir.
All righty. So let's get the bones down, right? So we're going to talk about like what bones we're moving. So you get your lumbar spine, right? And each of those, the lumbar spine, they're kind of grouped up here. That's just the lumbar spine, but it would be your L1 at the top, L2, 3, 4, and 5. Your L5 would be right down here at the bottom. Generally, we see pain right in between here, L4, L5. Those are the two sort of most commonly dysfunctional spinal discs that we sort of deal with. That and some that are up in the neck. And then you're also going to see your acetabulum. That's your actual pelvis, right? The acetabulum. It's like a steering wheel almost, and then you've got your sacrum. That's this triangle shaped bone that kind of holds everything together. Coccyx, which is the very bottom of that, that's your tailbone. And then your femur, your actual femur, that's sort of interacting with all of this, right? And so we talked a little bit about the femur on Friday because we were talking about the knee joint. Well, we're just moving a little bit north here, right? So looking at the acetabulum again, right? You will have like your actual hip joint. And this is the hip joint, by the way, like the where the sort of like when you raise your leg up, the where it pinches between your thigh and knob on the front of your hip there, that's your hip joint, right? Obviously this whole area is your pelvis, is all your hips, right? And so like you could argue it's like, well, there's my sacrum and my ilium, like those two working together. Yeah, your pelvic girdle, there's joints there, but what we call the hip joint is this ball and socket joint right here, where this ilium and this ilium are interacting with their respective femurs. So it's a ball and socket joint, like I mentioned, really, really, really mobile. But you will also see, look at all this connective tissue. Look at all of these ligaments that are all there, like creating stability. And you're not even seeing all of them, actually. If we look at like hip joint ligaments, you can actually see absolutely surrounded by connective tissue, which makes a lot of sense because, again, this is a very unstable area because there's not as much bone-on-bone contact. That gives us lots of mobility, but we need to have this soft tissue that like holds everything in place. So really, really important to keep those ligaments healthy. Then we're going to see your pelvic, like I said, we're going to see your pelvic girdle and the femur there, right? So that's the acetabular femoral joint, or more, hip joint, because that's a lot easier to say. You'll see your SI joint or sacroiliac joint. That's where your sacrum, the triangle, meets together with your iliums, your right ilium and your left ilium. And so they're going to interact with both those. And then, by the way, those two are also going to meet together right here. There is a little bit of joint right here called your pubic symphysis, and it's where the two sides of your pelvis are coming together and meeting. That is also a very strong connection. This is not a synovial joint, though. This is actually a non-synovial joint. This is actually a very stable, semi-movable joint. So there is, like I said, there's a little bit of rotational movement. So there has to be a little bit of movement here. But obviously, we don't want too much movement because that can cause dysfunction. And we certainly don't want to see a dislocation. Oh, God. I've seen pictures. Every time I see a picture, I'm like, ah. So that is, so what we're talking about is your sacroiliac joint. That's the sacrum and the either left or right ilium. SI joint is what we're going to often call it. And then there is a joint in between each and every one of your individual vertebrae, which we're not mentioning here. All right, so let's look at our hip musculature here. Let's talk about, the muscles that are associated here. So we're going to start with the adductor complex. You are going to see, and this is the thing, there's a lot of complexes here, right? There's rather than just sort of like one muscle that's doing something, right? Like there's the hamstring complex and the hip flexor complex and the adductor complex. They're all kind of like this group of muscles that are working together. So the first one you're going to see is your adductor longus. And guess what? It's the longest of the adductor muscles. So that's why it's named that way. And its job, if we think about it, is to concentrically accelerate hip adduction. I know it's a shocker, but it is. It's going to adduct the thigh, right? When it contracts, it pulls your hip inward, right? But it is in the front actually, and you can see it kind of attaches to the front there. So it also assists just a little bit in terms of hip flexion. So it can actually do just a little bit of hip flexion, and it does internal hip rotation. So again, if we go back to looking at like that pronation distortion syndrome, right? We talked about how, that is simultaneous movement. That is not only adduction of the thigh, right? It's not only adduction, like being squeezed inward, it's also internal rotation. So that adductor longus is a very likely culprit for pulling this muscle into this poor alignment, right? We see, let's see here, adduction and trying to find this. Sometimes they do such a great picture with this one where it's just like two arrows simultaneously. Not quite getting what I want here. That's okay. Anyway, what we are seeing, right? It's rotary movement, but it's also just frontal plane adduction. So there's that caving in action that we see there, right? There's that pronation distortion syndrome. Oh, this is Brookbush Institute. This guy's great. And then Brett Contreras wrote this one. Wow, what is going on? These are like the gurus. Brett Contreras, by the way, you might have heard of him. He's the glute guy. He's kind of a famous personal trainer. So that's your adductor longus, right? Accelerates hip adduction, hip flexion, and hip internal rotation. So if we need to stretch that muscle, you want to think about like the fact that it is all those things, right? So if it does hip adduction, right, it's pulling my hip in towards my midline, then I'm going to stretch it by pulling my hip away, right? I'm going to go into an extended position like this, right? But it also does internal rotation. So I don't want to do that, right? I want to keep it not necessarily in external rotation, but at least neutral, right? Because that neutral position is actually slight external rotation. Now, like we said, it also does hip flexion. So it wants to pull my thigh this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull it ever so slightly behind me. And that way, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm not just going to step straight out in the frontal plane. I'm going to make an ever so slight sagittal movement. I like to line my heel up with my big toe on the opposite leg and then move that straight away. And by going like that and keeping my leg nice and straight, right, now I'm stretching that adductor longus muscle because I'm performing all three antagonistic movements to what this muscle wants to do concentrically. I'm doing its integrated function. So now it's eccentrically lengthening because I'm in hip abduction, I'm in hip external rotation, and I'm in hip extension instead of flexion. So that's how I'm going to stretch my adductor longus, okay? Now, the next one we're going to see is your adductor magnus. And this is probably the most complicated muscle we're going to see today, only because this actually has two separate sets of fibers. This is a very weird muscle, kind of similar to the biceps femoris. We had our long head, which is, the long one, and the short head, which starts in the middle of the femur and then runs down and grabs the same spot. Your adductor magnus is kind of like that. It's this webbing almost that is attaching to the inner thigh there. And so you can see it's this like big webbing here. And what it's doing is it's going to run from your pelvis and it's going to run into the front and it's going to grab the front of your femur. Okay. So it's grabbing the front there. So because it's attached on the anterior fibers are on the front, it concentrically accelerates hip adduction, a little bit of hip flexion, and a little bit of hip internal rotation. So the adductor longus and the adductor magnus's anterior fibers are total synergists. They do exactly the same thing. Both of this muscle here and this muscle here are going to work together. You can even see, there it is, like the magnus is just behind it, right? You can see those fibers right there in the thigh. So those are going to work together. But here's the one that often throws people for a loop. You have also got your adductor magnus posterior fibers. So from the back, this is going to grab the back of your femur, and then there's going to be some fibers that are attached on these like posterior pieces of the condyle here. And so now you can see this is running from the midline, right? And then it travels out laterally. So it is still going to do adduction. There's no doubt about that. Like both adductor magnus and adductor, anterior fibers and posterior fibers, they both do hip adduction. But because this one is attached in the back of your femur, this is also going to perform hip extension, and it's going to perform external rotation. So this is actually going to rotate your femurs away from your midline, and this is actually going to draw your femur backwards instead of forwards. So in that version, the adductor magnus is antagonistic of itself. This is why this muscle is actually so great at creating so much stability in this hip joint here. And it's a big, big muscle. So that adductor magnus posterior fibers, because it does do a little bit of hip extension, sometimes what can happen is it can actually pull down on the pelvis. And when it pulls down on the pelvis, that can actually create a posterior pelvic tilt. So I don't know about you guys, but I have this bad habit of slouching when I'm sitting in particularly like office chairs. We have like a big squishy couch here in my house, and I hate it. And like, it's so funny. Like the roommates and I, like whenever we're watching movies, I sit in this like, little armchair instead. And they're like, why don't you like this couch? It's so squishy and comfy, and you can just fall asleep in it. I'm like, I hate it because when I sit into it, I sink into the whole thing, and I'm being just like flexed into like a freaking ball, and it drives me crazy. It's just activating my adductor magnus posterior. I'm just getting this like scared dog butt tuck, So you'll see sometimes in a posterior pelvic tilt. We're going to talk about some other muscles that are causing that as well. But you will see, yeah, kind of like that. I mean, he's also doing like a swayed back posture. Just don't see it that often. There we go. That's actually really good. So there you can see, like, he's got this very flat back posture, right? It almost looks like this guy doesn't have like a lumbar spine. It doesn't look at them like a lumbar curve, and that's because his posterior pelvic tilt, right? So that adductor magnus fibers are grabbing and pulling down in the back, along with very tight hamstrings, which are going to be down here as well. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but definitely very common there. So the anterior and the posterior fibers kind of work differently. And this is why you'll see sometimes the adductor magnus posterior is listed as an overactive muscle in the posterior pelvic syndrome. And then we have got our adductor brevis, which is the short one. And the adductor brevis concentrically accelerates hip adduction. It's also tied in the front, so it's doing hip flexion, and it's working in hip internal rotation. So your adductor brevis, your adductor longus, and your adductor magnus's anterior fibers. All three of these muscles do exactly the same thing. They are all synergists. They're all working together to adduct the thigh inward, internally rotate it, and perform a little bit of weak hip flexion. And we see this, right? I mean, how many people do you know have too much hip flexion, right? We see a lot of people with, I was talking about this posterior pelvic tilt. This is pretty rare, A lot of times what we're going to see is an anterior pelvic tilt. We'll see this posture right here where the pelvis is sort of dumping forward, right? And that's happening because hip flexors are pulling this part of the bone downwards, right? We're seeing this rotation where the hip flexors that are pulling down versus the low back that is pulling up, and that's creating this anterior rotation. So what we need to fix is you need to loosen up all those hip flexors, and sometimes it can be part of the adductor complex. And then occasionally with posterior, you'll see the posterior fibers are a little antagonistic there because they do hip extension and external rotation. So if you see a client with a butt tuck, well, maybe that's the tight adductor muscle. Then this is not an official like adductor muscle, but you do have your gracilis. We talked about this on Friday when we talked about the knee, but it is tied from the pelvis down to the inside of the tibia here, right? And so this is going to accelerate hip adduction, right? Because it is adducting, a little bit of hip flexion and a little bit of hip internal rotation. So this is here to help. It's here to help your adductor complex work, although it's a really small muscle. It's not meant to do a lot of work. And it also does just a little bit of tibial internal rotation. It also creates just a little bit of rotation in the tibia aside from the hip. And then there's also this short itty bitty little muscle back here that is also creating a little bit of stability, and that's going to perform all three of the same movements as well. So that's your pectineus, right? And it's just a little short little muscle right in the top of your hip. You can sometimes actually feel that if you're kind of digging really deep into your thigh, your quads are in the way, but you'll kind of feel this little short muscle. That's your pectineus. And so it's an adductor, right? It's going to pull towards the midline. It's going to do a little bit of internal rotation because it's tied it's in the front. So it's going to rotate the bones inward, right? And it does do just a little bit of hip flexion. It's acting as a hip flexor there in the front, which is sort of actually where, I don't know. I don't think of the pectineus when I think of the adductor complex. I think of it as a hip flexor. Then let's flip straight to the other side of the joint. So now we've talked a lot about hip adduction. Let's move into hip abduction, right? Let's go the other direction. So now your primary abductor is going to be your gluteus medius. And your gluteus medius is, basically right on the outside. You can see like it's sort of originating on the outside of your ilium, and then it reaches down and grabs over this this greater trochanter of the femur there, right? So that big knob on the outside of your hip, right? That's where your gluteus medius is going to grab. So when this muscle pulls, that abducts the thigh, right? That pulls the thigh outward. This is this is the anterior deltoid of your butt, so it's accelerating hip abduction, and it does do a little bit of hip internal rotation as well. Then we've got the gluteus medius posterior fibers, which is exactly the same thing, except that this does the external rotation. So laying over top of all of that, you've got even more fibers in the gluteus medius that grabs much further along the posterior aspect of that trochanter. So you can see they just grab ever so slightly different parts, right? Like this one's grabbing the front. We're looking at this one grabs the back. Yeah. We're looking at the front of the pelvis here. So this one's going to grab the back of the pelvis, and then this one's going to grab the front of the pelvis, right? Oh my God, I kept saying pelvis. Femur. God, sorry. Back, front, right? So these are both going to grab here, and that's going to create the difference in terms of internal versus external rotation. But for the most part, what we think of when we think of the gluteus medius, it's in charge of abduction. So whenever you are stepping side to side, that is what you are strengthening. So we love like lateral tube walking. This is a great exercise for strengthening that gluteus medius, right? That walk to the side that we see, right? That's perfect for strengthening because it's abduction, right? And she's doing a great job. See how her feet are ever so slightly pointed away and her knees are staying tracked over her toes? She's doing a really good job of doing a little bit of external rotation as well, which is going to only further strengthen that gluteus medius. Because again, this is the fix right here. We see so many clients with knees caving in, right? And it's just I'd say it's like our second most common postural distortion. So you'll see like knees caving in all the time, right? And so when we see this, they're internally rotating and adducting. So we are doing an exercise that causes external rotation and abduction. Another glute muscle you've got is your gluteus minimus, which is the small one. And this is going to perform hip abduction as well, but this one is also doing internal rotation. So your gluteus minimus is very similar to your gluteus medius's anterior fibers. They're both in charge of abduction. Gluteus minimus absolutely does abduction, but it does do a little bit of internal hip rotation. So again, this is sometimes, very rarely, this is where you'll sometimes see an underactive, an overactive glute muscle. If it is, it's probably your gluteus minimus. And so sometimes you'll need a little bit of like a hip massage. That's why digging a foam roller into your glutes can sometimes feel really good. If you just kind of go off to the side on the posterior aspect there, that can sometimes feel pretty tender. And that's your gluteus minimus. And then we're here, guys. We made it to the king of the muscles, the gluteus maximus, the largest muscle in your body, which means that it is, since we are personal trainers, this is our favorite muscle. Glutes, glutes, glutes. So this is going to accelerate hip extension, right? That's going to drive the femur posteriorly. And it's also going to do hip external rotation. So hip extension, driving that hip straight backwards, right? There's your hip extensions. That's a great way to activate that gluteus maximus or hip external rotation. This is actually another really great way. These are clamshells, and that is a freaking fantastic exercise to turn your gluteus maximus on because it is that external rotation. There's also this one. I call these hydrants. I don't know what their official name is. It's just a hip external rotation, but it looks like a dog peeing on a fire hydrant, so that's what I always call them. It's a great way to turn the glutes on, right? So even just going through like a little bit of an activation circuit, if you were to like start your workouts, next time you go do a leg workout, just start with a little bit of this, right? Do a couple reps, donkey kicks are a really good one. Do a couple reps of like a, hip extension, maybe 10 to 12 of those. And then do a little bit of hip external rotation, like a little bit of a clamshell there. That's going to be a great circuit to get your hips turned on, and that can really help with your squats. It can really drive you into the proper posture. We will also see, kind of, that's not quite what I'm looking for. Another one that is very NASM is single leg balance reach. So there's the single leg balance with reach, right? This is a, oh, look, there's Brent. You know what? We'll show this one. There's Brent Brookbush. This is the guy I was talking about earlier. He's a freaking guru. Everybody should subscribe to this guy's YouTube channel. This guy's a genius. But he's going to do the single leg balance with reach. So he's going to have his client. There's going to be 3 versions of this reach. So now she's doing, you can see there's the hip extension, which, I mean, I think you should be able to do it. It's you need to be able to control it eccentrically. So, when we do a single leg balance with reach, do the sagittal version where you go into, hip flexion. But the big one that we want to see is this one right here, that hip abduction. That's a really good one as well. So she's reaching to the front, she's reaching to the side. Now she's got sagittal as well as frontal plane movement. And then lastly, she's going to do one more where she scoops and externally rotates the leg and goes into hip extension slightly. Can we see the, come on, let's see the sideways one. Trying to look for a preview here where they actually do the movement. Yeah, she's losing her balance a little bit. So, all right, let's go with this one. So again, sagittal movement. So reach to the front, frontal plane movement, reach to the side, transverse movement, reach posteriorly and external rotation. So she's performing hip extension as well as external rotation. So this is a great exercise to activate the medial glutes and the maximal glute. This is one of the reasons why then, like in your textbook, man, when you're looking at like example workouts, I don't know if you guys have glanced at those at all. But if you have, you've probably noticed NASM's favorite, balance exercise. It's always single leg balance with reach. We love this exercise. It's a great way to turn the glutes on. So if you can do this, this is going to help with your squats. Babe, we were talking a little bit about this on Wednesday last week, right? This would be a great one. This would be a great one. So that's your gluteus maximus. There's the king of muscles there. All right. Now this is kind of an interesting picture. This is you'll see here, like I put a little asterisk because NASM, I don't know. I don't like the picture that they chose to use because the TFL is this portion, but this is your TFL and your IT band. So that's your tensor fascia latae or tensor fascia latae. That's the TFL. And that's the fibers that are running from the ilium, right? The iliac spine right there, right? This big knob. And then it runs to that greater trochanter right over here. But then there's also some fibers that start a little bit above that and run all the way down the thigh and insert onto the fibula. So that's going to create rotational movements. So that fibula, right, it's not attached to the tibia directly, right? That's creating rotation. So the IT band or iliotibial band, right, running from ilium to tibia, that's the band right there that's creating a little bit of rotation. So this is going to accelerate hip flexion. That is what this muscle primarily is. The TFL is a hip flexor. But it is also going to do a little bit of hip abduction, although it's not great at it. And it does a lot of hip internal rotation. So when you think of your TFL, right, it is in charge of helping with this. Again, that's hip flexion. And it does hip internal rotation, right? I'm going to rotate my hips inward, right? I'm rotating it in this way, which is what we often see. Again, we see a client with knees caving in, right? That TFL is creating that rotary movement. So this is definitely one of our most commonly overactive muscles. I mean, honestly, guys, the big thing that we're going to see so often is an overactive TFL and an underactive gluteus maximus and medius. These muscles right here are being inhibited by this overactive TFL that won't let go, won't stop contracting. But that's not your only hip flexor. That's just the first one. So that's a hip flexor, right? So now we've got, you can see our grouping here, right? We've got adduction, right? We've got abduction, but then we also kind of transferred right into hip extension. And now we're sort of in the hip flexion list, right? So the other hip flexors you've got are going to be your psoas, which if you've ever done like hanging leg raises and then you've been like sore the next day, they can get so as hell. But I'm cheap. All right. Anyway, so your psoas are these little muscles that are actually running from your spine here, and then they grab onto the front of the femur. So they're going to pull that femur anteriorly, right? It's going to perform that hip flexion. Does do a little bit of hip external rotation, but honestly, like nothing to write home about. But one of the really big things that your psoas also does is that it is also creating spinal extension and spinal rotation. So until now, we've been talking about like hip stuff, right? But this is where we're looking at lumbar movement. So when I say spinal extension, what I mean is this, right? That's going to pull my spine back this way because it's grabbing it and it's literally pulling in the front, right? It's pulling forward like that. Again, when we see a client with an anterior pelvic tilt, right? They've got way too much, you know, sort of low back arch Instagram booty going on, right? That is a very, very tight psoas. That's very, 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 very common. And then the other muscle that's very much associated with this, and you can even see it right here, is your iliacus. And your iliacus also does hip flexion and a little bit of external rotation, but the big thing is hip flexion. So psoas, iliacus, those two muscles are usually not referred to separately. In fact, it's even surprising. I mean, NASM's grouping up muscles left and right in this, you know, in your book and stuff. And I can't believe that they didn't just put these two together. So these muscles often work together. They call them your iliopsoas, which is how you will probably see it often listed if you're looking at an overactive muscles list. So if we go overactive muscles list, anterior pelvic tilt, we will probably see it listed as the iliopsoas. That's not what I want. Yeah, they're just saying hip flexors. That's honestly, that's a very accurate way to describe it. Like tight hip flexors, tight erector spinae. Come on. Well, I'll just give it a little help. Yeah, here, it's friggin' separated. They're saying like a shortened just psoas, but it really is. A lot of times, guys, you're going to hear it listed as the iliopsoas. Actually, there's a great picture, by the way. You can kind of see how all those muscles are actually working, right? Psoas running down, iliacus, they both grab onto the same spot. They share an insertion. Very freaking commonly tight muscle. And there we go, right? There's that anterior pelvic tilt again, right? An excessive low back arch. So iliopsoas are very, very, very tight. So the combined effort, yeah, there we go. So I was going to say, we got to put it somewhere. The combined effort of the psoas and the iliacus working together, like I said, that's your iliopsoas. Here's another muscle we already talked a little bit about when we talked about the knee complex, right? We've got your piriformis, right? Piriformis. Wait, what? No. Sartorius. I start reading down here. Your sartorius, this big long muscle that's running all the way from your iliac spine, and then it runs down and inserts onto the tibia. I mean, look at how friggin' far this thing crosses over. So it's kind of a complicated line of pull when you look at it, right? Obviously, it's going to perform hip flexion. It's right there in the front, so it's going to do hip flexion. But it's also going to do a little bit of like hip external rotation. So it's going to rotate your hip outward. And it does a little bit of hip abduction. So when it pulls, it can do just a little bit. But really, what it's known for is you know, the hip flexion, and really it's known for knee stabilization. So it accelerates knee flexion as well. It can do just a little bit of knee flexion, kind of like a hamstring muscle, and it can do a little bit of internal knee rotation. But really, what your sartorius is there for, kind of similar to the gracilis that's running down, is that's creating some stability on the inside of the knee. Meanwhile, your IT band is creating some stability on the outside of the knee. So when you're looking at like how we pasted all these muscles together, you know, like to create stability, right? You have this kind of interesting sort of knee joint, you know, where you've got like a, you know, a tibia that kind of comes up and forms like a little shelf there, right? And you got a fibula that runs along the side. And then you've got this big femur that kind of comes down right here. So we've got to create stability, right? I need stability to run this way on the inside. And I need to create some stability that runs this way on the inside, right? So we can see like a little bit of inside stability, a little bit of outside stability there. So this would be like the IT band, and this would very much be your sartorius. So, oh, and then, oh, they're not mentioning it here. That's weird. One more. Wow, that's very weird. Why is that out of that's missing. Wait. Oh, there it is. It's just, okay. It's later in the PowerPoint. We're gonna do it now. The last on this hip flexion, right? So we've got all of our hip flexor complex, TFL, iliopsoas, a little bit of the sartorius, and then the big one, guys, the big one that's very commonly overactive is that rectus femoris, right? Remember we talked about the rectus femoris on Friday. It is a knee extensor. It is one of your quad muscles that, you know, performs knee extension, but one of the biggest things it does is hip flexion. It's tied at the hip, not just on the femur itself. So because of that, it's going to do that hip flexion movement. And that hip flexion movement, you know, very commonly overactive. That's what's causing that anterior tilt. So when you see a client who has that anterior tilt, how are we going to fix that? Well, we are going to instruct them, if they're trying to stretch their iliopsoas and their rectus femoris, we're going to instruct them to go into hip extension and probably do that in a kneeling position, right? So they'll go like this. They're going to stay nice and upright. And then I'm going to lunge forward like this. And when I lunge forward like that, now my hip is being drawn posteriorly behind me, right? I'm just going to kind of stabilize like this. And then if I want to really get even more of a stretch on there, remember, what's the antagonist to hip flexion? The gluteus maximus, right? It's in charge of hip extension. So when I'm in this lunge here, I'm going to squeeze my glute on that same side. That's going to give me a deeper stretch. Then remember, this does a little bit of, this is attached to our abdominals as well. So if I want to get an even deeper stretch, I can take my arm straight up overhead as I lunge forward there. And now I'm really creating a little bit of hip extension and I'm loosening up that hip flexor, right? Now, if I need to get more into my rectus femoris particularly, right? Like this is really good for the iliopsoas. It does get the rectus femoris a little bit. But if I really want to get into that rectus femoris, remember, it's a quadriceps muscle as well. So if I perform knee flexion by maybe drawing my knee upward like this, as I am also here, I need a pillow. You will be driving your kneecap into the ground. So if you go like this and you drive that leg up, now I'm getting an even deeper stretch, right? Now I'm really hitting my rectus femoris because I'm doing knee flexion, which is the antagonist movement, and I'm doing hip extension, which is the antagonist movement. So those are really good. And then the other one that I mentioned that's super, super tight, tensor fascia latae, right? Super commonly overactive muscle. It's a hip flexor and it's an internal rotator. So what do I need to do to stretch it? I need to externally rotate and hip extend. So I'm going to drive my leg back into hip extension and I'm going to rotate my foot 30 degrees away from me. And I'm going to square my hips up and I'm probably going to take that arm up again and I'm going to lean away. And that's going to create a stretch right in that TFL. Okay, so that is any client with an anterior pelvic tilt, like those two stretches right there are going to be kind of key players. All right, we got to kind of go back just a little bit because I'm trying to go in the order that it's listed in your textbook. So the next one we've got is your piriformis. This is the one I mentioned earlier that can get super tight and cause piriformis syndrome or sciatica, as it's more commonly referred to as. You'll hear people say sciatica. And this one is actually a hip external rotator. This is a muscle that we want to be strong, you know, like we need more hip external rotation, you know, but occasionally somebody has too much of it. You'll see that bow-legged posture. Where you'll see a little bit too much. I love how there's just this, like, you can tell like which injuries or which postural distortions are common. Because you see like so many drawings in the ones that are uncommon. There we go. Yeah, bow-legged posture. Yeah, I'll bet, yeah, it's a cyclist. Of course it is. So occasionally you will see that happen. They have too much external rotation and not enough internal rotation. That's often caused by a tight piriformis. This muscle can also sometimes be associated with that posterior tilt that I mentioned earlier. So this is also something that sometimes needs to be stretched. And then it does a little bit of hip abduction, right? But really not very well. I mean, look at it. You can see like it's, you know, it's grabbing onto the top here. So yeah, it's going to pull, you know, and cause a little abduction there, but it's not great at it. and then hip extension, right, where we'll see sometimes that posterior tilting. All right, looking at our hamstring complex, because remember we mentioned how the hamstring is also going to, the hamstring complex is also going to affect our hips, right? We don't have just, knee flexion happening here in the hamstrings. We also have hip extension. So we've got that biceps femoris long head coming back again, right? Remember, the long head runs the entire distance, so it can assist in hip flexion, but the short head starts on the femur, so it can only do knee flexion. So hip extension here in that biceps femoris long head, and then we'll see the medial hamstring as well. So the medial hamstrings, semimembranosus, and the medial hamstrings, picture missing. What is going on with my PowerPoint today? I might have opened like an old version or something. And then we got the semitendinosus. That's that second hamstring muscle that's starting right here and grabbing the same spot, just a little lower down. But lateral hamstring does assist in hip extension, and medial hamstring does assist in hip extension. So both those are there to help in that movement. And then there's that rectus femoris, like we mentioned earlier. All right, how are we feeling so far about hip stuff, guys? We got abduction, adduction, internal and external rotation down. You guys feeling good about all that?
Yeah.
Okay, any questions at all? Nope. All right, let's look at the abs. All right, we're here, guys. Let's talk about how to get a six-pack. So the abs. Before we go into it, a brief summary on how your abs are sort of arranged here real quick. So your core musculature, right, it's not, we've been talking about the core all day today, right? We've been talking about how like moving the hips and stuff. Your core has 3 systems within it. This is how we actually want to think of our core, not just our abs. We want to think of it as these 3 systems that create like spinal stabilization and movement, right? So the first one is the local stabilization system, okay? These are muscles that stabilize your spine. So the first thing your spine needs to be able to do is stay in one position, right? Think about it. It's a bunch of Jenga blocks stacked on top of one another, right? I need to create some stability there to keep them from tipping over and falling, especially considering that like I'm going to be doing all this like movement, right? So your local stabilization system are muscles that stabilize your spine. And so imagine if you were creating, I'm going to try and keep this brief here. Imagine if you're creating like, here's your spine, right? Imagine this is my spine. And I'm just going to create why am I being so particular about this? I'm just going to create a little bit. Let's give it one more. So actually that'll work really well because there's 5, right? So here's your lumbar spine, right? Now, obviously this is not, this is your entire spine, but we got to create some stability in here, right? So if that's your spine, right? I need to create stability in the front of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a little bit of, this is where I normally, this is so easy to do on a whiteboard. I can just draw it so easily, but we need to create a little bit of stability in the front. So I'm going to wrap this whole area in the front like this, right? So that's going to be in the front there. That's going to be what's called your transverse abdominis. Okay. That's possible to see. So that's your transverse abdominis, which is creating a little bit of stability in the front, right? And we'll put that right here. Creates stability in the front. Okay. So there's your TVA. No, and that's your transverse abdominis. Sometimes we call it the TVA. Now, on the flip side, you also need to be able to create stability in the back. So we are also going to have some muscles that are posterior, right? Creating some stability there. So I'm just going to kind of put this ever so slightly like off kiltered like this. I should have done these in the other. I should have done these in the other order. Whoops. Yeah, let's do that, and then let me fix the yellow one here. Yellow one's in the front. All right. So creating some stability in the back, right? So this is the back side here. That is going to be what we call your multifidus. Or multifidus, okay? And your multifidus creates stability in the back, okay? That's what its job is, okay? So now, great, we've got stability on this side, and we've got stability on this side. So now I'm going to be able to resist movements. If I do too much like this, I got some stability back here that's pulling everything in place, right? If I do too much of this, I've got stuff here that's pulling everything in place. So I'm staying in alignment, right? Well, now I need to, think about that those Jenga blocks, right? I don't want anything spilling out of the front and the back, so great. But what about the sides, right? It could still spill out laterally. So now we have got your external obliques happening on both sides here, right? So your external obliques are going to be on both sides, and they're going to create stability here and here. So both of these are creating stabilization on the side, right? So that, right? So that's creating the internal obliques, and that creates stability on the sides, okay? So now that's going to resist too much lateral movement, right? And it's going to keep everything very protected, right? Now, we also have, so you can start to see how this is forming like a box, right? We've got the front of the box, we've got the back of the box, we've got both sides of the box. Now I need a bottom and a top. Okay, so at the top, you are going to have your diaphragm, which is going to be right here. That's going to create stability up above. Okay, so that's the diaphragm. Creates stability above. Okay. And then on the bottom side, you are going to have your pelvic floor muscles, and that's going to create stability down below. Okay, and there's your pelvic floor muscles. So that's the 6 sides to the box. NASM loves to ask you about this, by the way. Pelvic floor muscles, right, creates stability below. So there's the 4 sides to our box, right? Now I really I'm not gonna be able to move this thing around. Like I've got stability everywhere, right? I'm holding it in place in the front. I'm holding it in place in the back. I'm holding it in place on both sides. And I'm creating stability from below, and I'm creating stability from above. That's gonna keep all of my discs nice and stable. That is why we call it the local, because it's close to your spine, right? Like what's more center than anything? Like if local is like your hometown, local to your center, it's close to home. And it's the stabilization system. So the local stabilization system, muscles that stabilize your spine. That's your TVA, your multifidus, your internal obliques, the pelvic floor muscles, and the diaphragm. Okay, get that list memorized. In fact, this should be its own flashcard because that list will come up very commonly. Because here's what we know about most of our clients, most individuals. A lot of people have very strong movement systems. So they are able to move their pelvis around and move their femur and run and jump and stuff like that. Those muscles are pretty strong. But what people often struggle with is stabilizing their spine while they're doing those movements. So we often see problems with the local stabilization system. We see people with a strong movement system and a weak stabilization system. Now, the next one we've got is the global stabilization system. These are muscles that attach the pelvis to your spine. So now, right, that was just holding your discs in place. Literally, we were just only talking about the discs, right? But now, what about like if I had, what if I got like my pelvis down here and here, right? How do I create some stability between how, my spine's working and how my pelvis is working? How do I create some stability there, right? Well, that's where the global stabilization system comes in. It's more global, it's around the outside, right? So these are muscles that are honestly around the outside. So when we look at the global stabilization system, right? We are going to see those muscles around the outside. We are going to see muscles like your quadratus lumborum. That's your QL muscle, right? And which is a little tiny short muscle that attaches from your rib down to your pelvis. And it's in charge of these lateral movements like this. We're going to see those in just a minute. So that's your QL, right? My quadratus lumborum pulls up like this. What about like my external obliques, right? The ones I can see at the beach, right? Those like, the rotary muscles, right? What about those, right? What about my psoas that are in the front? That's again creating a little bit of that spinal extension, right? What about like my rectus abdominis, the actual freaking six pack that's tied on the outside part of my abs, the stuff you can see, right? That I'm always trying to show off in the summertime, right? Like, what about that rectus abdominis? Well, how am I showing that, right? That's the global stabilization system. It's around the outside. So you'll actually see this chart in your books. This is the actual chart from your book. So you'll see local stabilization system, and then you will see the global stabilization system. So very, 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 these are the muscles that are attaching your pelvis to your spine, right? And their job is to move your spine, right? Local stabilization system stabilizes your spine. Global stabilization system moves the spine. Most of our clients, think about every ab exercise that you see, right? It's all like crunches and extensions and rotations, right? It's all movements. It's like a reverse crunch, a hanging leg raise. Like, I love all those ab exercises. They're all great, but they are not creating stability. They're creating movement. So if I'm bad at creating stability, what ends up happening is you can injure your discs. You can move, too much in one direction, and dislocate those discs. So we definitely don't want to do that, right? Like we want to have stability in our spine. I'm not saying you can't have a strong global stabilization system and then walk around, showing off, your six pack or showing off your 11s, go for it. But what I am saying is if you are going to do that, you should also very much have a strong stabilization system. You need to work on the planks. You need to work on the Superman holds, the bird dogs, right? All that stabilization stuff that holds your spine in one position. And we need to be able to do that before we move it. So I like crunches. I do. I like hanging leg raises. I love ab wheels. Ab wheels are like my favorite because they're like the best of both worlds. You get both systems really, really good there. Love that stuff, but I definitely don't do any of that until I've built a foundation of stability with my clients first. And then we've got the global movement system, which are the muscles that attach your pelvis and your spine to, your extremities. Your lats are a good example of this, actually, right? Because that can, you can swim through water, right? That's going to move you around. Your femur, right? Hip flexor complex, adductor complex, all those muscles that are going to actually move your hip and move you around the globe, which is how I kind of like to think about it, right? It's your global movement system. Move me around the globe. And that's attaching your pelvis to your spine. So that's the core, right? The core are these three things. And honestly, the one I would tell you to memorize is this local stabilization system. Love to ask you questions. about which muscles are in the local stabilization system. They love that question, or variations of it. And that can be one that's like, God, it's a list of 6 muscles, you know? So sometimes that's a long list. Technically, it's 5 muscles because you get the internal obliques on the left and right sides, but you get what I'm saying. All right, let's go through those. We already kind of talked a little bit about them, but now let's start. We're gonna start with it's so funny. We went from the inside out. We're actually starting from the outside in. So we're gonna first look at the rectus abdominis. There it is. There's your 6-pack, right? And by the way, it's an 8-pack. It's not actually just 6. It's 8 individual little like sections there. And that's going to create spinal flexion. That's its main job, right? Concentrically accelerates spinal flexion. So it's going to pull my spine into flexion. And it does do a little bit of lateral flexion, does a little bit of this, not great, but it does a little bit, and it does a little bit of rotation, but that's, the rotation is definitely the obliques, right? So there's your rectus abdominis. Then, like I said, external obliques, right? Those muscles on the side, right? We're going to see those right here, which looks very different than how we normally see it, right? External obliques. A lot of times, it looks something a little bit more like this, right? We kind of see, kind of a webbing kind of similar to our, rectus abdominis, but in reality, it's really just a webbing, like, which is where, this can accelerate spinal flexion as well. It does do a little bit of like, forward motion. So even when you're doing crunches, you are actually getting some oblique work, nothing to write home about, but it is happening. And then it's really in charge of like lateral flexion. It does a lot of that, right? And then it does that contralateral rotation, which means the left side, when it contracts, right, rotates you this way. The right side rotates you this way. So it does the opposite direction from whatever side it's attached to. Which makes sense because it's an X, right? You're pulling from one side to the other. Now, flipping a little bit internally, now going to, so that's the global stabilization system. And don't get me wrong, like earlier I said the local stabilization system is responsible for stabilizing your spine. Your global stabilization system does do this just a little bit. So crunches can help you. They really can. They can create some stability in the spine, but it's something they can do, right? It's like again, kind of going back to they're a synergist. Going back to our Batman analogy, it's like, who do I want fighting crime? I want the Dark Knight, or I want Robin. Like I'd kind of rather have the main character. So use that local stabilization system to create your stability. Emphasize that. Now, on the inside, we're going to have the internal obliques. Okay, this is where we're seeing our first local stabilization system muscle. So a little bit of spinal flexion, a little bit of lateral rotation. Lateral flexion. And then it is a little bit of ipsilateral rotation. So this actually, the right side pulls to the right and the left side pulls to the left. So this is ipsilateral side, right? So this is what's kind of cool when you look at like how the internal and the external obliques are positioned. They cross each other. They create an X. And that's why this does contralateral rotation while it is working with this muscle that does ipsilateral rotation. They cross over each other like that, and that creates that rotary movement that creates that stability. Then we get your TVA. This is sort of the main muscle of the stabilization system. That is going to increase your intra-abdominal pressure. So this is the first time, by the way, on any of our muscles. Look at the isolated function here. It's the first time that it doesn't say concentrically accelerates, blah, 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 right? Because guess what? This is the first time that we really see a muscle not do concentric movement stuff. It's not its job. Its job is to create pressure that keeps your discs in place. It's not moving anything around. It's just creating intra-abdominal pressure that holds your discs in their positions. So that's your TVA. And then we are also going to see the diaphragm, very similar. This is also going to create spinal stability. This is this little dome-shaped muscle that actually, when it's relaxed, sits like this. And when it contracts, it flattens down like this. So this is another one that says concentrically pulls the central tendon inferiorly. And what that does is that opens up your chest cavity, drawing air into your lungs. That's the diaphragm's main job. I mean, yeah, it's here to stabilize, but really we think of it as, it's helping us breathe. So this is one of the reasons why, like, getting diaphragmatic breathing down is actually a very helpful skill for creating like abdominal strength. Talk to any mother who has come back from like delivering a baby. You will often hear, their doctors will coach them on creating intra-abdominal pressure, create that stability, and like, learn how to reactivate your diaphragm, your pelvic floor muscles. And then they don't really talk about it, but honestly, the TVA, they're talking about the transverse abdominis as well. Moving into your back musculature here. Again, we've got the movement system first. That's on the outside. That's going to be your erector spinae, right? These are your deadlift muscles, right? Which we think of in this portion here, but they are running all the way up to your cervical spine. They are running just behind the back of the head. Your erector spinae runs the entire length. And that's why that creates movement in the form of spinal extension. So this is the antagonists to your rectus abdominis, right? It accelerates spinal extension instead of spinal flexion. It also does a little bit of spinal rotation, and it does do a little bit of lateral rotation, lateral flexion as well. Then underneath that, we'll get to that one in a second. Underneath that, you can see your multifidus. Okay, your multifidus is basically the transverse abdominis version, but in the back of the spine. And here's the thing: this is not actually an individual. This isn't one big muscle. Oftentimes we think of this as your multifidi, which is how you'll often hear it referred to as, which are individual little tiny itty bitty muscles that create stability in between each individual spinal disc. So these are each separate, right? And they're each creating stability in between every one of the discs, okay? That is your actual multifidus. So now again, let's go in order, right? We got my transverse abdominis creating stability in the front of my spine. I've got my multifidus creating stability in the back of my spine. My internal obliques creating stability on the sides of my spine. My pelvic floor muscles creating stability from below, my diaphragm creating stability from atop. Then, if I go one layer out and I talk about creating stability while also creating movement, then I've got my rectus abdominis, which is going to crunch me forward. I've got my erector spinae, which is going to extend me backwards. I've got my external obliques, which is going to rotate me and laterally flex me. And I've got my QL, which I haven't talked about yet. So that's the multifidus. This is another stabilizer muscle in between each of your individual spinal discs in the back. So again, creating stability here. Bird dogs, right? Planks. And then we got the QL, the quadratus lumborum. This muscle runs from your bottom floating rib and attaches a little bit to your spine and a little bit to your pelvis. So its job is that lateral flexion. This is what's interesting. It's honestly in charge of raising your hips up like this. So again, when we see a client with that SI dysfunction, they've got that Trendelenburg gait, right? They've got that like sideways hip walk, right? They've got one QL that's contracting too much and one that's not contracting at all. And that's what's drawing their SI joint out of alignment, right? When you sit on your wall, let's say we just sit on the left side while all freaking day, right? This QL is shortened because now it's raised up a ½ inch compared to this side. So now you're getting a hip drop on the right and a hip elevation on the left. And that's creating, too much force on the spine. Now your discs can't move the way they're supposed to. Now, one last muscle that we're going to mention now, even though this is definitely more of a muscle that is reserved for talking about the shoulder complex, you do have your latissimus dorsi here. Your lats are in charge of shoulder movements, really. That's its primary job, is to shoulder adduction, shoulder extension, shoulder internal rotation. But you will notice it runs all the way down. And then see this white section right in here? That's called your thoracolumbar fascia. And it's where your lats are actually sort of meeting up with the dead center of your spine there, thoracolumbar fascia. Right, and it's this area right down here at the bottom. And, you know, it becomes your lats. So because of that, it can kind of pull the top of the pelvis, you know, anteriorly. So it does do a little bit of spinal flexion, just a little. I'm sorry, spinal flexion, spinal extension. It does do just a little bit of spinal extension, right? It can kind of cause you to let low back arch a little bit. So now when we talk about anterior pelvic tilts, sometimes it's the lats, which always surprises people, right? It'd be like, we're stretching this muscle, it's way up here. And it's like, why is this helping with my pelvis problem? And it's like, well, it's tied all the way down. All right, any questions on the muscles before we move into our agonist lists? We got a big list today. Feeling good? All right. So let's take a look at our key movements. So again, right, we've got hip flexion, right? Straight movement anteriorly, right? Then we got hip extension, which is straight movement posteriorly, so sagittal movements, right? Then we've got hip abduction and hip adduction, which are both frontal plane movements. So adduction would be adding it to the midline. Abduction would be pulling it away from the midline. Then we've got external rotation and internal rotation, which are transverse movements, right? External rotation, rotary movement away from the midline. Internal rotation, rotary movement towards the midline. Then we've got the combination, sort of the anterior and posterior pelvic tilts, right? So we can see an anterior pelvic tilt is going to be this, where now my pelvis is pointed down towards the floor, and a posterior pelvic tilt is that, where basically we get this flat back posture, which I freaking actually have. Tight hamstrings, they'll kill you. And then we see lateral pelvic rotation, right? Side to side. Oh, I remember what this is. I was like, why is there a YouTube link in here? This is like, I put this in here because it was kind of funny. Conan O'Brien. I always think of Conan O'Brien, where he did we call them the hip strings, where he would start the show and he would do this thing in the beginning. He'd walk out and, where is it? Do the thingy. Yeah, he does the jump, turns the band off, and then he like cuts the strings. So weird. There you go. That's lateral pelvic rotation. So that's where you're going to see that side to side movement. And there is a little bit of transverse movement as well, right? You could also have like a transverse movement in the front or a transverse movement in the back. That is another occasional version of a scoliosis, right? So sometimes you'll see it is just strictly lateral, and sometimes you'll see it as actually rotational. Then just looking at the spine, we've got spinal flexion versus spinal extension. Those are both sagittal plane movements. We've got spinal rotation, which is a transverse movement. And yeah, we already talked about, I guess we already talked about like the lateral flexion. So what muscles are in charge of what? Here's the way you need to memorize these lists. So your hip flexor complex, your hip flexion, that is going to be your rectus femoris is going to be kind of the big one here, right? All the way from here, running all the way down and becoming a knee extensor as well as a hip flexor. We're also going to see the iliopsoas, which is your iliacus muscle here. Oh, question. Charlie, you got a question? Oh no. So you've got your iliopsoas, right? There's your psoas, and then there's your iliacus. That is also going to perform that hip flexion. Then we've got the TFL. That's your tensor fascia latae, running from right here down to that greater trochanter. And then we see the sartorius, this big long muscle that runs all the way down. Sorry, 1 second. Charlie, do you got a question, buddy? Oh, there we go.
All good, all good.
Very good. So that's going to be all the hip flexions. Now, I will say they're not putting the adductors on this list. And remember, we talked about it earlier. Your adductors can do a little bit of that hip flexion, right? So the longus, particularly the brevis, and the adductor magnus is anterior fibers. Then we've got your hip extension, driving your hips backwards. The main muscle here is going to be your gluteus maximus, right? Driving that hip in the sagittal plane posteriorly. But then we see both the hamstring group as well, right? The biceps femoris long head and the medial hamstring, right? Medial hamstring working to assist, lateral hamstring working to assist. Then if we look at hip abduction, the big one here is going to be your gluteus medius. That's really going to be the main muscle that's mostly responsible for driving that leg out to the side, that abduction. But your TFL can help with that just a little bit. Your tensor fascia latae is there to sort of assist. We just don't want it to do most of the work. If you are doing this, by the way, if you're doing like hip abductions and you feel it mostly in like the hip, you need to focus more on driving your leg slightly posteriorly and then doing that movement so that you can get it back into your medial glute. If you're way out here doing it, you're going to be feeling it in the TFL instead, and that's not what we want because the TFL is often overactive. Then we're going to see that sartorius. Yeah, again, that helps a little bit. And then piriformis, yeah, like a little bit, you know. Hip adduction, though, right? That's your entire adductor complex. That's your adductor magnus's anterior and posterior fibers, your adductor longus, and your adductor brevis. Meanwhile, your gracilis, that big long one that runs from the inside all the way down, creating a little bit of stability, but it's there to help, right? And then the pectineus, that little shorty muscle that is also acting as a hip flexor, which, you know, should have been on this list as well. But that's going to be a hip adductor. Now, the rotational movements, right? We've got hip internal rotation and we've got hip external rotation. For hip internal rotation, it's really going to be your adductor complexes, right? Your adductor longus, your adductor brevis, your adductor magnus's anterior fibers, the gracilis and pectineus, yeah, a little bit. And then little bits of fibers of the gluteus medius. I actually hate that this is on here because we really don't see that happen very often in either of these. I don't want you guys to associate your glutes with hip internal rotation. Parts of your glutes, yes. If you're a massage therapist, yeah, keep it in mind because you need to know, you know, where to poke specifically. But honestly, do not think of your glutes when you think internal rotation. Think of your glutes, think external rotation. But one of the big internal rotators here is the TFL. So really the big ones, adductors and TFL, internal rotation. We don't want it. Too much of it, right? We see too many people knees caving in. Hip external rotation, though, we don't have enough of it. We need it, right? That's going to be your gluteus medius, your side glute muscle, your adductor magnus's posterior fibers, right? So the webbing that's on the back, your gluteus maximus is definitely in charge of hip external rotation. That's a big one, right? That's the main prime mover for external rotation. A little bit in the psoas, a little bit in the sartorius, and then the piriformis here, that little shorty muscle that runs from your sacrum to the outside. That does a little external rotation as well. Now, looking at that pelvic rotation, right? We've got anterior versus posterior tilting. These are muscles working together, right? Even though they are in different spots. So, question. Gotcha. So let's take a look at this anterior rotation, right? So in the front, it's going to be the rectus femoris, right? That's the hip flexor that's running from your ASIS, that knob on the front of the pelvis, down. So that's pulling the pelvis forward. Meanwhile, your psoas are doing the same thing, right? Your psoas, which are pulling on the spine downward, right? So we see the iliopsoas, that the iliacus, and the psoas muscles working with that rectus femoris. And then it's you can't see it because this is a sideways picture, but your tensor fasciae latae there as well. Your TFL is also assisting in pulling that pelvis forward. Meanwhile, in the back, your erector spinae, which is in charge of spinal extension, is grabbing the back of your pelvis and pulling it upward. So, it's literally dumping, think about it like a bucket of water. It's literally dumping it forward, right? I pull down in the front, I pull up in the back, and I dump all that water out. With a posterior pelvic rotation, you can see too much low back arch. We see like a flat back posture, not enough low back arch. So this is where we have ab muscles that are actually a little overdeveloped here. The external oblique and rectus abdominis muscles are contracting too much. And so they're grabbing the pelvis and they're pulling it upward, just like the erector spinae was pulling upward in our last version. So it's pulling upward like this. Meanwhile, the gluteus maximus and the hamstring muscles in the back, they're pulling downward. So you've got this overactivity happening that's causing this posterior pelvic rotation, or this butt tuck, right? Where you see, this kind of rounding at the bottom there, right? The hamstrings are pulling and the glutes are pulling this way. Meanwhile, the abs are pulling upward this way. And so it's rounding the low back around like that. And that's definitely not something we want. So these are exact opposites of each other. So what muscles do that, spinal flexion, right? Well, again, it's the rectus abdominis, it's the external obliques, and then a little bit of the internal obliques, but again, associated with the externals mostly. Then we've got lumbar extension, your spinal extension, right? That's your erector spinae, right? Muscles all the way in the back there performing spinal extension, and a little bit of the multifidus, but the multifidus is really, those muscles are so small, they're really not doing a ton of actual extension. They're honestly, more than anything, resisting excessive spinal extension. Then we see our lumbar lateral flexion, the side to side, right? That's going to be your oblique muscles, a little bit of the abs, right? The rectus abdominis, a little bit. But the big one here is the QL, that quadratus lumborum. Here's a much better picture, by the way. You can see it's grabbing each of those individual discs and then the top of the pelvis there. So again, pulling laterally, right? And then the exact opposite is true of lumbar rotation, right? Rectus abdominis, right? A little bit of rotary movement, but the big one here, external obliques. That's the big one. And your erector spinae, that's another really big one. So if I pull, this way, if I grab resistance and I pull backwards, my erector spinae is going to help with that. If I grab from the side and I rotate this way, my internal or my external obliques are going to assist with that. So that is the entire lumbo-pelvic-hip complex. I know that was a really long one today, just in terms of like how many muscles we've got. It's a pretty extensive list. But you'll notice that they're all in groups, right? They all work together. Your adductors adduct, your glutes abduct. Your adductors internally rotate, your glutes externally rotate, right? Your hip flexors perform hip flexion, your hip extensors, your glutes, they perform hip extension, right? So everything's sort of like, agonist to antagonist relationship, right? And yeah, that is our whole list there. I do recommend, guys, get really familiar with what is the local stabilization system versus what is the global stabilization system. Get used to the inner ab muscles stabilizing and the outer ab muscles, moving. Any questions, guys? Maybe 3-guy questions? Well, heck. All right. So today is not a homework day. Today's day, what? Today's day 9? Yeah, today's day 9. So no homework today, but if you haven't started working on your flashcards, definitely, get that list open. I haven't heard from anybody who needs them printed or anything just yet. But yeah, keep plugging away at that.
Yeah, I was able to, I'm sorry, Brad. I was able to print it out over the weekend. So yeah, I'm going to start on those soon.
Yeah, just glue stick them. Like, that's just cut them out and just glue stick it on there, man. It's so easy. We didn't have that when I was in school. I had to, I photocopied my actual textbook, which is actually why I keep it for nostalgia purposes, but its spine is completely broken. And like, basically tore all those out of there. But yeah. All right, guys, I'm going to let everybody go, and I will see you guys tomorrow morning.
Okay, bye. Thank you.
All right, have a good one.
See you guys.